Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hello and welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. This is Dr. Habib and I'm here with JP. How are you, JP?
I'm doing really well. Thank you.
This episode of the Health Upgrade Podcast is brought to you by Truvaga. Have you been looking for a simple way to feel calmer, think clearer, and sleep better? Imagine achieving this with just 2 minutes a day. I'm excited to introduce you to Truvaga, a handheld device that supports your nervous system through gentle vagus nerve stimulation. As a doctor specializing in functional health and wellness, I've seen firsthand how Truvaga has accelerated healing in my clients. I've used this device to help people with a range of issues, from sleep disturbances and heart palpitations to digestive dysfunction, nervous system imbalances, and mental wellness concerns. The results have honestly been remarkable. Truvaga is designed to catalyze and accelerate the shift in your body from fight or flight to rest, digest, and recover mode, helping you manage stress, maintain mental clarity, and unwind more easily. It's not just theory. I've witnessed its positive impact on real people facing real health challenges. The best part? Truvaga fits seamlessly into your routine. No need to carve out hours for wellness. Just 2 minutes a day can make a difference. It's a small investment of time for potentially significant benefits in how you feel and function each day. If you're curious to experience Truvaga for yourself, visit truvaga.com/upgrade. You can save $30 on your device by using the code UPGRADE30 at checkout. Remember, that's truvaga.com, truvaga.com/upgrade. It might just be the first step towards a calmer, clearer you, just as it has been for many of my clients. So today we want to dig into a bit of a topic that has been talked about quite a bit in healthcare, I think, in a more recent manner. Probably in the last 8 or 9 years, it's become quite utilized in therapeutic practice. And we want to talk about how, in general, people can utilize fasting into their therapeutic or daily lifestyles to help optimize their health. Okay, so there's different ways that people can fast. And I want to be really clear that today's episode is a discussion about the power of fasting or how fasting can help improve health in a positive way. We need to be a little bit conscious that fasting and starvation are two very different things. Fasting is voluntary choosing to stop the ingestion of food and to take a break from the ingestion aspect of the digestive process. Starvation is involuntary. And obviously, starvation is something that if you perceive that fasting is starvation, it will affect you in a very negative way. So we want to be really conscious of this particular difference and this disparity between fasting and starvation. So first off, I just want to start with that. Fasting is voluntary by choice and done so with some sort of intent, whether it's therapeutic, whether it's spiritual or religious. Every major religion includes fasting in some way, shape, or form. So we need to note that this is a practice that's been around for thousands and thousands of years. But from a definition standpoint, it is a voluntary or a chosen therapeutic tool to support health in some way, shape, or form. Any insights on fasting that we should start with as we jump in?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I'm glad to see that you tempered that idea that it's only been around for 8 or 9 years, because it's been around for a few thousand years. In fact, I would argue it's been around, at least if you sort of merge the involuntary component of it, it's been around for millions of years. I mean, we evolved as a species where we went through periods of not having food, especially as a hunter-gatherer, even before we had any agriculture of any kind. There's just ebbs and flows to the amount of food that's available. And so our bodies had to learn how to deal with, and all animals, frankly, all life forms, have to learn how to deal with that ebb and flow of when nutrients are available. Ingestion is one way. Storage is something that we all know how to store excess energy and nutrients that we need. We're actually quite good at it, and there's reasons for that. But it's really changed in the last 50 years with refrigeration and the logistics of moving food around, that we've got food available to us all the time. And so I think it's taken on a really important role as a voluntary thing for us to restrict ourselves from eating at times, because that's how we evolved. We evolved in a setting where we needed to restrict ourselves, or food was restricted from us. And by eating all the time, we're not living the way we evolved, and that has health consequences associated with it. So, I think religion was trying to keep that alive, and cultures kept that alive. But I think now the biohacking community, the health conscious, integrative medicine, functional medicine people are starting to recognize that it's not just a spiritual practice, it's a health practice. But I think a great place to start is actually just understanding what happens when you eat. What happens? What happens to those high energy content molecules that are in the food that we are eating and digesting? I think that's a great place to start, because it explains some of the things that are happening cellularly at the subcellular level that are at play when you eat and you have nutrients available versus when they're not available. And that's really what the story at the scientific level really is about.
I like that. I think that's a great place for us to go. I completely agree. We, as humans, evolved through this idea of feast and famine, right? There were moments where there was a lot of food, there was availability, and we developed biological mechanisms to enable storage of those energizing nutrients for later use, because there were going to then be times of famine when we didn't have excess food, right? And this was dependent on weather patterns. This was dependent on geography. This was dependent on, like, were we moving through different areas, different plains, different savannas? Were we inundated with different potential food sources? A lot of this evolved with the advent of fire and cooking and utilization, or making our food more nutrient dense, more bioavailable, easier for us to then consume and utilize those nutrients. So there were a lot of different specific things that occurred throughout human history that have created these specific biological mechanisms by which we then utilize food in different ways, how we gather and store and utilize energetic molecules. Let's dig into food and what actually happens when we eat food, when we ingest these nutrient-dense foods.
Yeah, I think it's worth actually taking it back one step, and you suggested it, so I want to riff off that, which is that the size of our brains actually is likely the consequence of the fact that we harnessed fire for cooking. I think we've talked about this before, but just in brief, there's a pretty strongly held theory at this point, but it's got a lot of strong evidence to support it, that when you eat raw foods and that are not cooked, it takes a lot of energy to actually break it down. And so the digestive process actually consumes some portion of the calories that you're eating. When you cook your food outside, you're chemically, through the cooking and the heating process, you are breaking down the food, things like cellulose and other, sinew and other things that are more difficult to break down. You're breaking them down outside the body in a chemical process that enables you to consume in much smaller portions, much a higher level of nutrients and energy density. So all of a sudden, instead of it taking 6 hours of eating to consume effectively 2,500 calories, you can now do that in 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And that allowed the energy dense brain and central nervous system to grow. And so our brains actually grew in large measure because we were able to consume more calories. But let's now talk about once it gets in your system. So the digestive process, and I think we have an episode all about how the digestive process works, but let's get it outside of the intestines. It's now been absorbed into the bloodstream. It's going up through the portal vein into the liver for its first pass through, and you're detoxifying, chemicals that are in the food. But ultimately what you want to do is you either want to transport it directly in the bloodstream, or there are transporting proteins that will bring nutrients, whether they be amino acids or fats or other things, to your cells. When those nutrients arrive at a cell, the cell absorbs them, takes them in. Sometimes there's special processes that have to be initiated for that to happen. Things like the uptake of glucose by fat cells or muscle cells. Requires insulin. It requires GLUT4 to transport that glucose into the cell. But what you have inside your cells, and this is just a fascinating discovery that David Sabatini and his team up at MIT really did an incredible amount of work while he was there looking into, is this molecule called mTOR, which is the mechanistic. It used to be called the mammalian, but they discovered it's a lot more animals have it than just mammals. So it's called mechanistic target of rapamycin. And rapamycin we can talk about separately. That's a drug. But what they discovered was that this protein has amazing qualities. It forms complexes with other helper molecules, if you will. But ultimately, mTOR, the complex, either complex 1 or complex 2, but mostly complex 1, mTOR has the ability to sense whether or not there's nutrients coming into the cell, whether there's amino acids, there's methionine and lysine sensors, literally little pockets that are on this protein that when those amino acids fit in there, that tells that protein to do something, to signal to the cell that, hey, we've got amino acids. There's another groove where ATP sits and that then tells the cell that, hey, we've got energy. There's some peripheral molecules and proteins that are measuring water and other things, even temperature, to make certain that when the circumstances are right, growth is promoted. And this is the insulin growth factor 1, AKT, mTOR pathway. And this pathway promotes your DNA and the mechanisms for reading proteins and generating or reading genes and transcribing them and then translating the mRNA into proteins. So you're making things, you're copying DNA, you're recreating new organelles. All of that really high energy, high nutrient intensive processes, all of those things are happening as a result of nutrients being present, new nutrients coming into the system. But keep in mind that that's great when you're growing. Growing child needs to have all of that energy available, whether in the womb or outside, to grow and mature into an adult. But once you've fully grown, you don't want to necessarily be growing all the time. You don't necessarily want to be flooded with nutrients all the time. That's not the way we evolved. And so I think there's a fair amount of consensus at this point that having your mTOR on all the time and making proteins all the time and growth signaling being on all the time is a recipe for a lot of bad things. Cancer is unregulated growth. There's lots of inflammation that can happen and deregulated things happening in your system that you don't want.
I think it's a consequence of the type of lifestyle that we tend to live today, where we have constant access, constant desires. We're at this position where we're probably in the general population having more than 3 full meals daily.
Oh,
right?
We're grazing. We're grazing constantly.
And this is resulting in the fact that we have these stats coming out of 12% of Americans being metabolically fit and 88% of Americans being metabolically unfit. And
that's based on what we call normal. And normal probably isn't really that fit either.
Exactly. Normal and common are very different things, right? Like common is where we currently stand, as common is to have 3-4 meals a day, numerous snacks. I see it happening with my children's school that I feed them breakfast before they go to school, then they have a snack, then they have lunch, then they have a snack in the afternoon, then they come home and they want a snack before they have dinner. And like we're providing nutrient dense foods on a continuous basis throughout the day, not allowing even on a daily rhythmic pattern for us to go into that famine state, right? Or for us to have that rhythmic pattern.
It's not even good food. And that's part of the problem. The snack foods and even the foods that are comprising our meals are actually quite engineered to make you more hungry. There's a lot of talk right now about, how the food industry, especially with highly processed foods, they're out to make a profit. And the best way to make a profit is to make food so appealing and so, never satisfying you, always leaving you wanting more, that we end up grazing all day, all through the day, and that's a really unfortunate situation that we're in. I always used to say that the food industry as a whole should see its profits growing at exactly the same rate that the population grows, because if everybody's eating approximately the same amount and approximately the same types of food, then as the population grows, so grows the profits. That's not what's happening. They're becoming very profitable because they're becoming very good at chemistry.
And what they've hacked, or what they're doing, is essentially teaching you to eat out of habit rather than eat out of hunger. And we've learned that if we don't feel good, food will make us feel good. And it's this desire for this dopamine hit from certain types of foods that make us feel a certain type of way, creating these emotional reactions internally that drive us towards certain types of foods. This is what food engineers do, what chemists that are working in the labs, which is a weird thing to say, that food companies have chemists working in their labs, in their warehouses, in their communities, to make food more desirable, to make it more habitually habit forming.
This is the sort of insidious thing that I think Callie and Casey Means and their movement is really exposing, is the fact that in the 1980s in the United States, the companies that are processed food companies of today were independent, but they were bought up by the companies that made tobacco. Now, I think back to the fact that my grandmother was a smoker in the 1950s and the 1960s, probably even in the 1940s. But when the Surgeon General finally came out and said that smoking was bad for you, she quit. Now, I'm not saying that my grandmother didn't have tremendous willpower, but I also know that the content of the tobacco was quite different back then. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the fact that there's so much more nicotine that's been bred into the tobacco. But I want to throw out another possibility, that it's not just the nicotine in the tobacco that's addictive. It's the 600 other compounds that have been added into the cigarettes that make them even more addictive. Because this is what they've done with food. When RJR Nabisco, used to be the Reynolds Tobacco Company, bought Nabisco. And, the Altria Group, it's not Philip Morris anymore, it's the Altria Group. And the group includes hundreds of other food companies. And what they're using is that same chemistry that they use to make cigarettes 100 times more addictive. I'm sorry, my grandmother had wonderful willpower, but if she were a smoker today, it'd be much more difficult for her to get off those cigarettes. And I don't think it's necessarily just the nicotine. That's not to say that nicotine isn't addictive, but there's nicotine in a lot of foods. The New England Journal of Medicine has an article talking about the nicotine content of foods: eggplant, tomatoes, cauliflower. These are products that people don't become, or not products. They are food stuff. They're vegetables that are not addictive. I've never seen a person addicted to eggplant, and yet it has a very high nicotine content. So is it necessarily the nicotine in the cigarettes that's what's really addictive? Or is it maybe some of those 600 compounds that are being added in that make it more addictive? And those same compounds are being added into processed foods. So I know this is getting a little far afield, but I'm going to bring it back around. I'm going to do the weave and bring it back around to those compounds are making us not fast. It's making us constantly hungry. So I think we need to recognize why we're being driven, it's a profit motive, and how we're being driven by these additives that are being added into processed foods. And I personally find that if I eat processed foods, which I do very, very infrequently, they're very unsatisfying in terms of actually quelling my hunger. And that when I eat whole foods and I eat things that are nutrient dense, but not doctored to be addictive, I actually don't want to eat more than maybe once or twice a day. And I go long periods without even being hungry at all.
I completely agree with you there. I think it's becoming harder to be empowered to take that power back and to say, I don't need this or I don't want this, right? And that's where the engineering is really affecting us and making fasting so much harder, or making those moments so much harder. And I think there's also the element of, we were taught that no child should go hungry, that hunger is one of the worst things that can exist ever, when in reality,
breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
yes, exactly, right? These concepts that they were bred into our subconscious. We understand, or we know all of these phrases that counter this concept of fasting or abstinence from food in a certain pattern. And what these have done, it's created this idea that hunger is bad, right? And we don't want to be hungry. When in reality, we should be able to learn what true hunger means and to eat when we feel hungry, not eat out of habit.
We even use it in our language. We say, is somebody hungry? And when you say, if that person's hungry, that means they're really focused, they're driven, they're ambitious, they're going out and getting something done. So be hungry, be hungry physically. I find, and this is scientifically demonstrated, that when you're hungry, you're more alert, you can concentrate more, you are productive, all of those things. I mean, we find that the hours of the day at work when people are most efficient and functional are not right after they've eaten.
It's right before.
It's
Totally.
when they're hungry. They're getting stuff done when they're hungry.
Yes.
So actually, we've long since completely abandoned this idea that breakfast is the most important meal of the day in our house. I mean, I realize there's probably parents out there who are going to think that I'm a bad parent, but none of my kids wake up in the morning and have breakfast. They go to school without breakfast. And they're focused because we know that the first classes of the day in the school that they go to, and a lot of schools do this, they put the first classes of the day are your math, your English, your history, your science. It's the less critically important classes, and I'm probably going to get hate mail for that, but that are in the afternoon. That's when you have recess. That's when you have your other classes, your electives, we'll call them. And I know that that's when the kids aren't really focused. They're not paying attention. So I think being hungry is something that we need to not just think about from a health standpoint, but from a career standpoint, from a productivity standpoint.
Yeah, we could take this and go many places. Like, hunger is voluntarily being hungry is a very good thing. And I think that should be a huge take home from anybody who's listening today, because hunger has been construed in our minds or through whatever pattern or who you're listening to or what you're talking about. Hunger has been taught to us as being a bad thing. And that came out of the concept of starvation as being this issue, and that hunger is involuntary and that hunger is a bad feeling. When in reality, you're exactly right. When you're hungry, you're driven, right? You are driven to get food. You are driven to accomplish something with your business. You're driven to do something more. And so hunger is a very good, very promoting, demanding, powerful experience that we should all try to have in a voluntary manner and utilize. And that's really where the power of fasting comes into play, right? Where from a metabolic perspective, from a cellular health perspective, let's get into some of the benefits of taking a break voluntarily from ingesting food.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what are some of the good things that can happen here.
Well, I just want to riff off one thing you said, and then we'll dive into that. My uncle is a world-renowned spine surgeon, and does scoliosis procedures. And scoliosis is a very difficult surgery, oftentimes involves opening a person up in their back and then flipping them over and opening them up in the front, and then flipping them back over and having to readjust what you did in the back. And these surgeries can take 12 to 16 hours. And there's no breaks for lunch, okay? Nobody's breaking in the middle of a surgery when they've got a patient open on the table. So it's a regular occurrence for surgeons who are doing long procedures to go 16 hours without eating. Now, when you do that and you're focused and you're concentrating, because there's no opportunity to like sort of daydream and go off and think about something else for 20 minutes while you're in the middle of a surgery, you are ultra focused. And that ultra focus that you have also completely blinds you to the fact that your body you may be hungry and you don't feel tired. I mean, he talks about the fact that when he's over a patient like that for 16 hours, there's no hunger, there's no having to go to the bathroom, there's no feelings of tiredness, there's just focus. And it's only after he's done that fatigue will set in and hunger you'll feel like you have to go to the bathroom. All of those things hit after you've lost that focus, lost that concentration. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from that experience and translate that over to what is actually happening in the body physiologically with nutrients. So to get to the next point, what you were saying is, okay, what happens when you do go without food for some period of time? Well, there's a whole host of different things. The first thing is that very quickly, you are going to deplete the glucose that's circulating in your bloodstream. You only have a tiny amount of glucose in your bloodstream at any time. It's like a teaspoonful. Okay.
Ideally, you only have a tiny amount.
Actually,
even if you're diabetic, it's very minute. Yes.
Even if you're diabetic, I mean, maybe it's an extra half a teaspoon. It's not that much. I mean, the concentration is pretty tiny. What you do have also is glycogen in your muscles. So your muscles, depending on the shape you're in and how fit you are, it has different storage capacities for glycogen. But your liver and your muscle cells create and store glycogen, which is a substance that is very quickly turned back into glucose. But even that, there's not a tremendous amount of it. You only have maybe a 20-minute supply of glycogen if you're exercising vigorously. You only have about a 20. Maybe if you're an elite athlete that's built up the storage capacity, maybe you've got a few minutes more. But it's not a lot. What you actually are relying on is what are called ketone bodies or fatty acids that are being mobilized out of fat cells after the insulin drops, because you can't get anything out of the fat cells while insulin's high in your bloodstream, because your body is saying, no, I don't want to go after the storage. I want to leave the storage stuff alone until they really need it. I'm going to use up the glucose. I'm going to use up the glycogen. Then insulin levels drop, and that's the point at which you can start using the ketone bodies and other things. That's why I think it's so great to fast and then exercise. We're probably getting a little ahead of ourselves in the conversation, but what happens inside your cells when you've gone through the process of fasting is you switch out of that insulin growth factor, AKT, mTOR pathway of growth, and you move into a separate pathway, which is called catabolism. That's where you're using up things that are in the cell. You're recycling. It's like spring cleaning. You're taking all the things that are inside the cell that's debris. It's, proteins that didn't fold properly. It's proteins that have been damaged. It's organelles or portions of organelles that aren't functioning properly. It's mitochondria that have been damaged. It's everything in the cell that's garbage, that's like the debris, and you're putting it literally into a bag. Okay. What happens is there's a pathway that's the opposite of mTOR. It's called AMPK, AMP kinase. And it's sensing the fact that you've depleted your supply of ATP, and you're starting to build up AMP. And we can get into the details of that in a second, but basically, because it's pretty cool, when you get that AMP level rising, then AMP kinase senses that, and it starts to build this literally a bag. It's called an autophagosome, which is related to autophagy, And what it's doing is your cells start putting all the garbage into this big bag. And this big bag is membrane, this bubble, is sitting there. And then after it's sealed, the cell will then merge with that bag a group of smaller bags that have what are called, they're called lysosomes, because lyse means to break apart or to split. And so what's inside is caustic material that is, when it merges with the bag, it's like putting acid in there. And everything that's inside that bag gets broken down. It gets broken down to its individual original components. So you're breaking your proteins back down to amino acids. You're breaking your organelles and your membranes back down to the fatty acids. You're doing all the things necessary to basically do a spring cleaning. And then when that's complete, all those nutrients are now the nutrients that your cell reuses. It's a wonderful process because you're getting rid of all the things that are broken and you're giving back the building blocks so that you can remake those things that were broken in a better form, and it's rejuvenating. And that's what happens when you fast for a long enough period of time, that it gives the cells that signal that says, okay, no nutrients around that are new. I'm going to use the old stuff.
So what is that long enough period of time to enable that to occur? Here's the magic question here.
It's definitely more than what we're living with right now.
100%.
But you can accelerate the rate. Some people will say that if you're not doing anything strenuous, it could take a couple of days to get into that state really robustly. But my trick is exercise vigorously and not strength training. Don't do resistance training when you're in this state.
In a fasted state, yes.
Do endurance training. Do endurance training in this fasted state. So I do my endurance training in the morning. I stop eating, ideally by, 8 o'clock at night. And then I'm up until, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning working. And then when I get up in the morning.
You're a night owl.
Yeah, I am a night owl. I get up in the morning and I go to the gym and I'll run, typically I'll run 8 miles. Well, I guarantee you by the time I'm a mile or two into that run, I've used up any glucose that's left. In fact, there's probably no glucose left in my system at that point. My insulin levels are super low. I've got a pretty good dent into the glycogen stores that I might have had. And I'm using the ketone bodies that my liver's been making since probably 2 or 3 in the morning. It's been making ketone bodies. My brain's been functioning on that. My muscles are going to use that. And I'm relying on that. Now, it's also going to use up some protein. I'm probably burning protein at that point also. But it's going to just get regenerated. And then I come home and I don't touch anything to eat until afternoon. And typically it can be 2 o'clock in the afternoon before I break that fast. So I'm trying to get at least for a couple of hours into that state where I'm doing the spring cleaning. I'm doing it every day. Again.
I like that a lot. A couple things to point out. Number one, cardiovascular or endurance type training in a fasted state is beneficial. It accelerates that move towards low glucose ketogenic type state where autophagy can be promoted and accelerated. The AMP kinase activation can take place. Number two, fasting does increase ketones. It does accelerate putting us into a ketogenic state. So this is another great piece to the puzzle for anybody who's looking at adding things in or changing their dietary protocols to enter ketosis more regularly. Fasting goes hand in hand with a ketogenic style diet. They work really, really well together. This is why there are therapeutic ketogenic diets and there's therapeutic fasting diets. And when you combine the two, they tend to have really powerful effects. It's really, when we were speaking to the metabolic basis of cancer, and
Thomas Seyfried, yeah.
Thomas Seyfried, that's right. So this press pulse method has this exact method within it. Not to say that we're here talking about how to handle cancer, but there is a huge parallel in metabolic health and how to therapeutically affect cancer positively.
Yeah, and when we've talked about cancer with Dr. Seyfried. We've got an upcoming episode. In fact, by the time this gets out there, it'll be out there with Dr. Anthony Chafee, who is promotes the carnivore diet, which again is, but also, when we talk about longevity, and we've had a few episodes about this, there's caloric restriction diets, and there's most of the big aging experts that are out there doing research themselves, when they're talking, they'll tell you they eat one meal a day. They've restricted that window of when they're eating down to a single meal. And Dr. Chafee talked about the fact that he's a carnivore. He eats only beef, almost exclusively, and he eats once a day. And that is something that I'm finding, that the more you move towards that carnivore existence, the more you start to weed out extraneous meals and snacking. It just doesn't happen. You're not looking for it.
Because the nutrient density is so powerful, and the bioavailability of these nutrients that comes into your body is so powerful that you inherently reduce that need for more food. You inherently reduce that hunger or that drive towards caloric intake, which then is self-promoting in this autophagy fasting, intermittent style fasting window or this particular pattern.
Yeah, it's actually, I know I'm probably going to get hate mail from the food industry people, but it's a function of what types of calories you're taking in. When you're taking in healthy fats, and healthy fats include saturated fats that are in beef, you need those, and you're taking in the protein, then you don't feel hungry as often, which is why the food industry, in their drive to sell more food and drive more calories into people, but not necessarily overwhelm them with nutrients, they extracted the fats. They called them healthy because they took the fats out, and they put carbohydrates and sugars in. What they did was two things. One, they removed nutrients, so you are going to feel like a need for more food. They took away the fats and the proteins that actually satisfy you and keep you not hungry. And they inserted in sugars and carbohydrates that carry calories, but they don't satisfy you. You remain hungry, and as a result, you eat more. And the problem with that is, getting back to sort of the not just the profit motive, but the science behind this, is when you get yourself into that state where you're not eating so frequently, okay, you also are changing how your mitochondria function. Because when your mitochondria are inundated with glucose and sugars and carbohydrates all the time, they become inflexible. They don't like to switch over. In part, your liver won't switch over to making ketones. Your fat cells won't release the fat because your insulin levels are high. And your mitochondria end up only using glucose and carbohydrate as fuel. When you're in that inflexible state, it's not healthy. It's not good. You end up with lots of inflammation, and inflammation is one of the drivers of aging, along with metabolic dysfunction and mitochondrial dysfunction. So I think that this idea of restricting the window in which you are eating and fasting for the rest of the period is not just a healthy thing to do for short periods. It's really a way that you have to sort of adopt going forward. And that can be, you'll find that you'll lose weight on this because you're not absorbing anywhere near the same number of calories, and yet you will feel less hungry. In the long run, you will actually feel less hungry because you're eating fewer calories in this state.
I think this is so powerful for people to hear and to take home and to utilize. And one of the best things I think we can do is to provide a couple of different patterns or tools. You've alluded to a couple of them. You've alluded to the idea of one meal a day. You've alluded to the feeding window, which is kind of a time-restricted feeding pattern. Let's go through kind of our top patterns of fasting that people can practically use in their day-to-day lives, so that these are tools that they can either use in a therapeutic manner or rules or guidelines that they can live by to enable this fasting process to truly take hold and do good work for them. Start with a couple. I've got a good one that I want to end with there as well. So you go right ahead first.
Yeah, no, I think you start with sort of historically, the idea was you go on a 3 to 7 day water only fast. So that's something that people do. It's not necessarily bad. It's actually probably pretty good doing it every once in a while. But I think the work by Dr. Walter Longo has demonstrated that it's not necessary. You can get the same benefits and maybe get more benefits because you're going to do it more frequently with something that's far less taxing on you as a person, which is intermittent fasting. And I actually think intermittent fasting is sort of the ideal balance. You get that time restricted feeding or intermittent fasting, you get the same benefits in terms of activating the autophagy that you're looking for, and mitophagy sort of it prompts the replication and building of more mitochondria. You become more metabolically flexible. I think that is the easiest thing to do. You might find in the first couple of days you feel hungry in the morning. Oh my gosh, I'm used to eating. You can have black coffee, just so long as it's not, not putting creamers in it and sugars, and you're not going to Starbucks for a pumpkin spice latte with 1,000 calories. Okay, you're just having a black coffee. If you need that in the morning, by all means, we're not telling you not to have caffeine, but just water or caffeine, like a tea or a coffee that's black until noon. Because what you want to do is you want to restrict your window down to 8 hours, at least initially. You may find after you've done that for a little while that you just sort of naturally aren't that hungry, and it starts to shrink down. Now, the goal of intermittent fasting, strictly just intermittent fasting, is not to reduce the total number of calories that you're going to ingest. That's not the goal. So you're really free to eat whatever you want in that window. Obviously, you should eat good food. You should eat things that are not highly processed and filled with sugars or, some of the negative oil types and fat types that are out there. You want to eat healthy fats. You want to eat protein. But you shouldn't necessarily feel restricted in what you eat. You may find that you're just not as hungry, and as a result, you naturally will not eat as much, and you will see that you'll lose weight. I mean, that's physics. You don't take as much in. If you're still using it up at the same amount, you're gonna burn off more.
Now, there is some research that's recently come out showing the difference between that 8-hour feeding window later in the day and that 8-hour feeding window earlier in the day. And there is some debate there. There is some unique kind of practice that needs to be included in there. I think for each individual, you want to find the window that works best for you. In an ideal world, you're not eating within the hour that you wake up, right? We're not waking up and going straight to the kitchen and having that initial meal. And you're not ending your day with a meal right before you fall asleep, because we know that food right before bed, within the 3 hours prior to falling asleep, will affect your sleep negatively. This is fact now. These are not fictitious things. We don't want to eat right when we wake up and right before we fall asleep. We want that window to be away from those sleep times, because digestion is a very energy intensive process. So noting that it needs to take place at a time separate from sleep is number one. And then, do we want to have meals earlier in the day versus meals later in the day is going to be a very individual choice. And it depends on when you're falling asleep. Exactly.
Family
Whatever
things,
works best.
Kids are in school, when they've got sports activities. It is, I will say, it's probably more difficult, but it may be better. Do your window in the morning to mid afternoon and not noon to 8. But for me, the number of miles that I'm running and just the level of hydration that I need to rehydrate, I'm just not interested in eating until afternoon. And I've got kids in school, so they're not coming home until late with practices for sports and other things. So for me, social reasons, family reasons, it's just much easier to do the noon to 8, or really for me at this point, it's usually about 1:30 or 2 in the afternoon and done by 7:30.
And that's exactly where individual specifics are going to play a role, right? If you don't have kids, you don't have to worry about those things with like wanting to have your meal with your kids in the evening and running around with errands and stuff the same way that a parent does. Then that window may be easier for you to do, where an earlier window may be more of the type of window that somebody without kids can handle. So figure out what works best for you for each individual. Are you more of an exercise in the morning person? Are you more of an exercise in the evening person? Are you more of a strength training, bodybuilding type of person? Or are you more of a cardiovascular endurance training type of person? Or do you do a bit of both or whatnot, right? As in an ideal world, I believe everybody should be doing a little bit of both.
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right.
So those are important to note. And I know we're talking about fasting, but how we move affects how we fast, and how we fast should affect our movements and our ability to be active in our active lifestyle. So that's an important thing there, I think, to include. OMAD is taking it to the next level, right? I feel like what you talked about, that 8-hour feeding window, is kind of that perfect entry point for people that are looking at doing this, trying to figure out what it feels like, what their bodies will respond. That 8-hour feeding window for most people is that perfect entry point and tends to have really positive benefits, enough that you're in that fasted state for 16 hours a day. I think that's a great place to start.
If you combine it with the intermittent fasting with a low carb, no sugar, low carb, good healthy fats and protein, doesn't necessarily have to be carnivore. You can do the same thing with plant protein. But if you do that, my bet is that you're going to lose the excess body fat that you have. 2, you're going to have more energy. You're not going to have the highs and lows of your glycemic index floating around. You're going to be more productive. And I think there's lots of health benefits that are going to come along with that. I will say, I alluded to this before, that you want to do your endurance exercise to help accelerate yourself into that AMP kinase pathway of autophagy. You want to do that in a fasted state. However, I do think that your resistance training, and you're right, everybody should really do some resistance training also, especially as you get older, because the loss of muscle is a real thing, and you've got to battle against that. It's pretty easy to battle against it. Just do a little resistance training. But doing that either right before you're going to break the fast or right after you've broken the fast, maybe 90 minutes in, is much better, because that's the time when you actually do need to heal. You are going to, after you've worked out and you've made micro tears in the muscle and you need to, rebuild it, that's where growth is required. And so you do want to have nutrients available for that. Get some,
particularly protein at that particular
get 30
time.
to 60 grams of protein into your body quick, and then you'll start to heal faster as a result. So I think that, and don't discount the importance of some fats too, because remember, membranes are made of fats and cholesterol. So every cell that needs to be rebuilt, lots of membranes that need to be rebuilt as well. So you want to have them available.
I was introduced to this concept a while ago, and it's grown on me quite a bit. And it's this idea called 5-1-1. So the idea of 5-1-1 is kind of the longevity-based diet. And what it is 5 days of this 8-hour feeding window. Okay. What that allows for is that 8-hour feeding window is when you take in your important nutrients, you get your calories in that 8-hour window, and then you allow for 16 hours of fasted state where we get the slight little bit of cleanup that needs to occur at the cellular level. So those 5 days, you're going to have that 8-hour feeding window. Then we have the 1 day, and the 1 day is kind of a feast day. It's the day of the party, right? We get to be more social. We get to have a bigger breakfast.
You've taken the buffalo down, and you're now you're eating because it's going to go bad if you don't eat it. So let's eat everything.
So get those calories in, get those nutrients in. That's phenomenal. So that's that first day following the 5-day gap of the time restricted feeding. So 1 day of party time and feasting. And then the next day is almost a 24-hour type of fast. So 5-1-1. So 5 days intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding, 1 day party, 1 day cleanup. And the idea of this is we're initiating this feast and famine cycle on a weekly basis. And I think this is a new way to reframe fasting from a daily pattern into a weekly pattern. And I like the idea of thinking about it in a weekly pattern, because if you have 1 day off one day where things are thrown off, it's very easy to get back into a weekly pattern or to reinitiate that weekly pattern and say, did I do a good job this week rather than did I do a good job this day? And so if you're having trouble or you're having difficulty with a daily pattern that is very difficult potentially for newcomers into this state to initiate, start with this 511 weekly reframing. Because if you had your party day, then you know that it's time to recycle back into this.
I think that that's really helpful for a subset of people who, that's the concept of a cheat day, which is sort of that first one of the two. The second one, I think, is going to be very difficult for people. So I'm going to take the devil's advocate's position and say, just like children need to have a regular schedule, and when you throw them off the schedule, it takes days to get you back onto it. I think that one cheat day of the feast, it's probably biologically and evolutionarily relevant and appropriate. But by the same token, I think that that's going to make that next day of full fast really difficult.
And I agree with you because evolutionarily, we weren't cheating with cakes and cookies and chocolates and sugars and excess carbohydrates, right? And crappy fats. We were quote unquote cheating, or we were feasting with the new kill, right? We had access to a new, very high quality, nutrient dense meal, and that was the feast. So even with that 501 pattern, I still would say, yes, allow for yourself to live in the world that we live in, but still follow that 80-20 rule where 90% of the time you're on dietary trend, like with that whole foods intake, with that high quality, nutrient dense foods. And you allow for a little bit of leniency on that one particular day, knowing and being fully conscious that the next day, the goal is to recycle back into that 511 pattern.
So I understand the strategy, and I think it's a good one. And I think for some people, it's going to be the only way they're going to be able to really hack doing it emotionally. They're going to need that cheat day. For other people, I think just getting into this rhythm and just I probably haven't had a bite to eat before noon in years. I mean, I just don't do it, and I think I'm just generally pretty full by the time I get to 8:00, and I'm not interested in eating after that. But I will say, a couple of things, because I oftentimes talk about one of my kids, my daughter, who's been academically really affected by vagus nerve stimulation in a positive way. But my other daughter, my oldest, I remember she was probably not much more than 8 years old. I mean, we're talking, 10 years plus ago. And we were going to a holiday party at my wife's brother's house. And they were sort of notorious for having lots and lots of food, especially sweets. And my daughter was she's getting conscious about her weight. And she decided that she was not going to she told me and she told herself, I'm not going to have more than one cookie, Dad. I'm going to limit myself one chocolate chip cookie. And there was a party going on, and all of a sudden I saw my daughter, and it was wintertime. She's outside sitting on the swing alone by herself, 8 years old outside. And so I walked outside and thought maybe somebody said something to her. Maybe there was something going on that just made her feel alienated. And I wanted to go outside to just check up on her. And I said, what are you doing out here? And what she said to me was that she had made that decision. She told me about it. I said, I remember. And she said, Dad, I ate the first one. And without even thinking about it, I found myself halfway through the second cookie. And I knew I had to get out of the room. So I just put it down. I left. So, what I take away from that for everybody is, and there's another piece to her story in a second, but what I take away just from that piece is that if you're always allowing yourself a cheat day, then the stuff is going to be around the house. And you're going to find that it's really difficult the day after that feast to impose upon you something that Mother Nature involuntarily imposed on people, your ancestors, by 10,000 years. So the cookies are still going to be in the house, and I think what you're going to find is that it's going to be a lot more like my daughter, who had that second cookie halfway down her throat, and said, no, I don't want to do this. I said I didn't want to do this, and I'm now doing what I didn't want to do. I'm not going to do it. And she left the room because she needed to get away from it. So I caution people, you got to have a lot of willpower to do that. And so, with great responsibility, great responsibility, that sort of thing.
Power. Great power comes great responsibility. Yes.
If you're gonna have that cheat day, that power day, you got to have a really great responsibility. Otherwise, just do it the other way. Now, the other thing I was going to say about my daughter is
one little hack about the cheat day, if you don't mind. One recommendation I have is don't cheat in the house. Don't have that day in the house. Go out to a meal, have that meal with friends at a restaurant, go elsewhere. Don't do it in your own home, and don't bring that stuff home. If there's any leftovers, whatever, don't bring it home, because yes, you will then be re-promoted or desire that feeling again the next day. And so this is a way to hack that, to initiate that reigniting of the pattern of fasting the next day, so that you're not then pushed into this. And just on the point of cheating, the real question is, who are you cheating, right? If you're having a cheat day, you're cheating yourself. You're not cheating anybody else. It's you yourself. I'm a victim of this. I tend to have these challenges myself, and it's a matter of knowing that that's who I'm cheating. So if that's a pattern that you or somebody you love is experiencing, I think just even reframing it in their mind to say, oh, you're having a cheat day. Well, who is getting cheated with that cheat day?
The other thing I was going to say is about my daughter. I've been talking about some of the things I've been doing in terms of myself. My daughter has been observing me doing this. And, being a 17, now 18-year-old girl, she's conscious about her weight, conscious about things. And things had started to rise, and all the numbers that she didn't want to see rising. And so she saw what I was doing, and she said, you know what, I'm just going to do the same thing. So she adopted that same strategy. Every aspect of her physical well-being has improved. Her, not just, cognitive function, but emotionally, her athletic ability. I mean, she just went to the gym, 2 days ago and did 16 miles, came back and said, yeah, I just kept going. Run 3 miles, walk a mile, run 3 miles, walk a mile. And I did it 4 times. That's 16 miles. She's like, yeah, I was there for a while. And then she does the cold water plunge, and she goes in the sauna. And it's a nice gym. It's not the gym I go to, but she, that's something she could, I remember, we're talking 9 months ago, she couldn't run 3 miles. It has just changed her. She's dropped, I got to think she's dropped 30 or 40 pounds. And she feels great. She's so happy about it. And when I talk to her about what she's eating, she's not starving herself. She's just eating like a carnivore. It's eggs and it's steak, it's things like that. She's not feeding on cookies and cakes and chips and things like that anymore.
I think having these practical examples and real stories of people that have changed their lives using tools that we talk about, in this particular case, using intermittent fasting as a therapeutic, beneficial tool for day-to-day life productivity, for just being able to show up in the best way that you possibly can, are so powerful for people to hear. I want to end today's episode just talking a little bit about any final thoughts on how to integrate fasting into your life. I think it's a great time because we're releasing this episode just as the holidays are ending. We're getting into the new year. People are re-engaging with some of their health and lifestyle goals. And so what are some of the best tools that people can start to implement? What are some of the best ways that we can implement fasting into our lives?
It doesn't take very much. I think people get scared about the term fasting. So I think time-restricted feeding is maybe a better way to verbalize it. And just get yourself out of the mode of thinking that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. That's a lie that was fabricated as an advertising campaign for a company that was making cereals. Obviously, people making cereal want you to think that eating their product is really important. Well,
for those who don't know, it was Dr. John Kellogg, yes, of the Kellogg's.
Yep.
brand of cereals.
Yeah, and there's lots of things going on about Kellogg's and the other things that they put into their cereals. I just as an aside, I mean, this entire thing about food dyes and the consequences of these products that are not regulated by the FDA and yet have these profound effects on us neurologically and physiologically that are being put into our foods and then
and promoted to our kids.
Promoted to kids, and they are not allowed. They are illegal outside the United States, and yet they are put in the product in the United States and not outside the United States. I have to ask the question: if you're the CEO of that company, and I'm going to call it out, if you're the CEO of a company that's doing that, and you get caught with your hand literally in the cookie jar, okay, and you've got a group of people that are saying, "Don't do this, stop doing this," why on God's green earth would you dig your heels in and decide you're not going to make that change? I mean, and I've been the CEO of a publicly traded company before, okay? I've been on boards of directors. My advice would be immediately, especially if you're selling to kids. I mean,
and especially if it's something that you're already changing in other nations, like very clearly the Canadian version of the product and the American version of the product are incredibly different. You can see the difference when you look at the colors of them.
Take it as an opportunity.
It's absurd. You already have a way to change it. So why aren't you changing it?
The first thing you should do is align yourself with the people that have called you out. Align with them and say, thank you for bringing this to our attention. You're absolutely right. You have found the evidence. It's just gotten out there in the literature. We are going to be reactive to this. We are a family company. We want to have our products be, the ones that are, that children feel comfortable with and parents feel comfortable using. If anything we can do to make our product better for that, we're going to do it. And then just adopt it right away. Say we're going to get rid of that, and we're bringing in the product that we're making for everybody else anyway. And that then takes away all of the additional questions that are going to come along with, like, well, why'd you do it in the first place? It was branding. We just it becomes easier you're not the enemy anymore. You're part of the solution. Don't dig your heels in. Don't dig your heels in and be like that. You're gonna torture your company. Don't do that.
I completely agree. Ultimately, and yes, we did take a little bit of a tangent at the end, but we're coming to the same point here. We want humans, we want the people around us, our loved ones, to be healthy. We want to encourage that health upgrade that this podcast stands for. And what that means is being able to take back control, to empower yourself to be in control of your health and to be the CEO of your body. And what that entails is utilizing tools like intermittent fasting, utilizing tools like eating whole foods and choosing foods that don't have artificial dyes, and not feeding into these lies of breakfast being the most important meal of the day, and not feeding into the lies of hunger is a bad thing, right? Ultimately, we want everybody to feel their absolute best. And if that can be done utilizing these tools, we're going to promote these tools to you. So our promise to you over this year of 2025 is we are going to bring to you the top, best experts and conversations about topics that we have found to improve not only our health, but the health of those in which they are researched. That is our goal for this year. We're starting with fasting because I think it's one of the most beneficial, most powerful, and simplest things for people to implement into day-to-day lives. In fact, it costs you less. You save money when you fast versus not. And so this is a tool that requires no investment, and yet it's still so challenging for people to wrap their head around. Eating less is beneficial for you. Eating less often is beneficial for you. Fasting is a good thing. There's a reason it's in every single religion in some way, shape, or form. Find the type of fasting that works well for you, implement and do that. Let's make 2025 the healthiest year yet. Thank you so much for this wonderful episode, JP.
Yeah, brilliant. That was a great conclusion. I loved it.
We're going to really push this year to make America and the world healthy again. And I think it's really powerful and a great time for us to encourage that. So if you got to this point in the episode, thanks for listening. Share this episode, please, with one person that you feel could benefit from this information and help them upgrade their health. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye, guys.